I just wanted to briefly state that this is part 2 of a multi-part series on mature buck beds, what they look like, where they're found, and the ways you can go about hunting them. If you missed the first video, you can check out the link in the description below, or you can go up here and click on this link and it'll take you to that. In that first video, I highlighted 3 examples: a mountain buck example, a swamp island buck example, and a river bottom buck. In this second part, I'm only going to show you 1 buck bed instead of 3. And the reason I'm going to do that is I had to make separate videos because of the length of the videos for the examples, the 3 examples, and then separate videos for how to hunt each of those buck beds. And I think it'll serve you better if I put not only the buck bed, but also how to hunt it all in one video. So this will just be 1 buck bed. And this example of a mature buck on public land in the northern half of the whitetails range is found in mixed terrain and mixed vegetation. I mean, there's just a little bit of everything. There's conifers and hardwoods. There's some lowlands where you've got a lot of red dogwood and other water-loving shrubs. And then you have out and out what I would call marshland, cattails and phragmites. So check out this bed here. I am in the midst of a bunch of phragmites. And I put my binoculars out there for scale. It doesn't really do it justice. This bed is about 6 feet long, because it stretches all the way down here to the bottom. And it is really well worn. The buck, in this instance, beds with his back to the left there. You can kind of see a curved shape along the phragmites here in the back. And so he faces to the right, and he pretty much is good on a west, southwest, and south wind here. By the way, there's a couple of nice trees here, and when I say nice, these are monsters. When I say monsters of trees, I mean that in a phragmite patch like this, where it's almost all bog and really wet areas, these trees being 6 inches in size, that's huge. You can see where one is decayed there, and that's what's made this tremendous mound right here. And it's only about 8 inches higher than the wet spots over here to the side. But that's all a buck needs to be able to stay dry and not die of hypothermia, because his body's always wet. So now I'm standing directly above the bed. There's my binos. And over here on the one side is a path that exits that way, and it heads to some mainland. And then back here behind is another path that extends out that direction, and again there's some mainland after you walk a distance. And then there's what seems to be the escape hatch back here. It's not as beaten down, but it's certainly a deer trail. I want to show you 2 more things here. There's a historical rub on this tree here. It's about 2 inches in diameter, the one in the front. But there are no other rubs in this bed. And I think a lot of times people think that if it's a buck bed, there has to be a rub nearby, or at least a fresh one. And that's certainly not the case. The other thing I want to show you is what the view is for the buck. I mean, those phragmites go up to 15 feet high. And right now, it's the dry stalks from last year that are the highest. But I mean, he is completely hidden in here. And there you can see the new green that's starting to reach about 8 feet right now. All right, so let me orient you to this buck bed. The images that you just saw in the video of the actual buck bed, I want to put them on a map for you so that you can have some context. This is a really unique piece of public land. It is really diverse in its habitat. You have areas that are nearly pure stands of conifer trees, which is true down here in the southeastern corner. You have areas that are almost completely mixed deciduous trees, and that is true here in the northwestern corner. There are areas that they're not swamp, but they're places that can get flooded from time to time, and I almost call them internal swamp transition areas. They're made up of red dogwood and buttonbush and elderberry and wild highbush blueberry and other wet loving trees and shrubs. And then there is this area, and I'll draw the transition here for you, of an actual, I guess the best way to describe it would be that it's not really a swamp, it's more of a marsh. And the reason I call it a marsh is because it's made up almost exclusively of cattails and phragmites. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with phragmites, but these phragmites, they make up 4 families, and they're all invasive species from Europe and Asia. And unless you live on the easternmost part of the eastern seaboard, within miles of the ocean, where there's a really small population of native phragmites, a family of native phragmites, you're looking at invasive varieties. And they are really detrimental to the habitat of wetlands because they really outcompete the other plants. They really suck nutrients up out of the water. When they die, it can cause a huge amount of oxygen depletion, which can really do in the fish population. It can affect animals from being able to cross through because these patches of phragmites are really, really dense. And oftentimes I've noticed these cattails, which are native, and the phragmites, which are invasive, will grow side by side, and in some cases they'll be mixed. But it seems, for whatever reason, that there are certain patches outside of that transition between the two. Cattails dominate one area and phragmites another, and that may be more to say about the phragmites because of their aggressive nature, and it may just be a matter of time until the cattails meet their demise at the hands of the phragmites. But I'll just draw this for you. There's an area right in here, and this area here, the football-shaped area, is phragmites. And down in here, where the buck is another section of phragmites. And then over in these areas, all along here, we have mostly cattails. And then every once in a while, there's a small tree in here. These trees here, which look like they may be something, I don't know when this radar picture was taken, but those trees aren't there anymore. There are some trees, but I showed you in the video of the bed. If you have a 6-inch tree, that is a monster of a tree in this area because it's just so wet almost all the time. So that gives you kind of a little bit of orientation. This mature buck bedded here is surrounded by other bucks. So if my memory serves me correct, because I don't have all of these marked exactly, but there's one here, there's one in this area, there's one about here, there's one close to the transition there, and there's one in the bowl of this marsh. There are other ones up through here, but I'm just going to focus down on this area so we can remain more laser focused on this video. So I don't know that deer can think this far. In fact, I'm pretty confident that they can't. But what ends up happening, when I discovered this buck, I actually bumped a bunch of other bucks around him. And what happens in multiple areas where you have a mature buck, doesn't matter so much for the most part what the ecosystem is like, unless you really have a very low population of deer. The big, most mature and dominant buck is going to get the king size bed. He's going to get the best bed possible. and every other buck is going to take what's left over. And so you have this happen pretty frequently where you've got bucks all around him. So if you would go in after him, which I wouldn't advise, and I'll explain that in a second, you're probably going to bump a lot of other deer before you would ever get to his bed. And so it's almost like the mature buck has this security system around him. And again, I don't think bucks can think that far. It's just naturally what ends up happening. All right, I want to show you another really important area as it relates to this mature buck, and that's up here in the easternmost area. And it doesn't necessarily stand out real distinctly, but this area in here is a huge doe bedding area. It is made up of red brush and those wet loving shrubs that I talked about. And there are tons of does stacked in that area. There are other doe bedding areas along this slot swamp, but for our purposes, I'm just going to focus on that one area so I don't make it too difficult for you to follow what I'm describing here. So one of the reasons why I think this mature buck actually lives here year round is because it's incredibly secure all the time. Even in the heart of winter, even after spring has sprung, but the phragmites don't start growing until the water warms up to a certain temperature. They're only about half height the middle of June, to give you some context. They still have incredible structure in there to protect them. They are protected from predators it's almost ironclad against predators, including hunters. And that's partially because when you go through these phragmites, you can be incredibly careful, but you're going to sound like an elephant. It is really hard to go through them quietly because most of the trails are pretty narrow and there aren't very many of them. So the phragmites grow very densely, and for you to actually go in and negotiate that, you are not going to beat a mature buck in a phragmite patch. Furthermore, you usually can't see more than 10 or 15 yards in front of you. And so you basically have to round a corner, already have your bow drawn, and get lucky that the buck would be broadside to you to even have a chance. And of course, you know how quickly deer can react, and that's assuming you get in quiet, which isn't going to happen. So that's one reason why I think the mature buck is bedded in this spot, because it's the most secure location on this property, at least within a mile or so that I've found. The second reason is he doesn't have to go very far during rut to be close to the does. It's only about 200 yards or so up here to this main doe bedding area. And there are does that cross in this area right here all the time. And so he's getting constant intel about what does are hot, and he can get up and respond really quickly. Of course, if you have watched any of my videos to this point, it shouldn't surprise you that all the pressure, hunting pressure, comes from the dry land. People set up in the woods. Actually, most of them don't even come down to the transition here, but the pressure is definitely felt up in here, and it's also felt down in here. And that is one of the main reasons why you have an inordinate amount of deer in this slot swamp right here. So knowing that other hunters are setting up in the big woods, so to speak, is as important, in my opinion, as to knowing where the deer are, because the deer will respond to the pressure around them. And if you do what everybody else does, you're probably not going to see the mature bucks that other people rarely see. So in a bit, I'll get to my setup, how I would hunt this buck. But let me show you a few more things that I think are essential to understand what's going on here. I mentioned it before, but there's a huge trail right here, and it's probably because this is the most narrow part of the swamp. And lots of lesser bucks, even mature bucks, I have them on trail camera, and does for sure with their fawns cross in this area. Also, I showed you in the video image of the mature buck bed, I showed you that he has a couple of trails that come right into his bed. One of those goes to the north, and it comes out like this, and then it kind of hooks in here, and then it goes north from there. When I discovered this buck, I actually had a trail camera set up in this vicinity. And it's a nice 10 point. I first discovered him when I believe he was 2.5 years old, a couple of years back. I believe this year he'll be 5.5 during hunting season. So he should be one that I would want to pursue this year. I just backtracked this trail because I was getting him pretty regularly and ended up finding this bed. There are actually a couple of other beds around his main bed. They are nothing near the quality of this one, but it wouldn't surprise me if he uses those on certain winds because of the direction that they're set up. And right now it doesn't seem like they're getting used. So it seems to me that those would be used when there's higher pressure by other bucks and perhaps even the buck that I'm talking about. And then he also has an exit that goes to the south, and that comes down here, actually goes out through the cattails and emerges onto the dry land. This makes perfect sense. Up here to the north is what I would call an A+ food source. It's actually on private land. There's actually no ag on this public land, which is becoming more and more typical in our state. But that's where a lot of deer go, and that's why there's a lot of traffic from south to north in the evenings. And then there's also a food source, and I'm drawing it in here, but it's almost 3/4 of a mile to the southwest. So he's basically exiting to points that come out to the edge of the swamp, and then they go to the food sources. I don't know if you noticed it in the video, but there is not a lot of vegetation to be eaten in these phragmites. They are so dense that they choke out most everything else. So a lot of times he may get up and browse during the day, but he's probably going to have to go out here into the cattails and find a little patch of, I've seen high bush blueberry in there, real small patches of red dogwood, those kinds of things, a few willows, and that's what he's going to have to eat to hold him over. And I believe it, in a lot of ways, it makes his evening and morning food sources way more strong than on perhaps private land, because I think he has to eat a lot more, because I don't think he's getting a lot to eat during the day. And when I've surveilled this spot from a distance to watch, I'm not seeing him come out during the day. So whatever he's eating in the interior. And I'm telling you, there's not much in there for him to eat. And then I showed you the image of a third exit, but it's not very well worn. And that one goes directly out here, and I believe that it is an escape hatch. That's his default if he has to get out of Dodge real quick. So that kind of gives you the orientation, I guess, of what's happening here. I should also mention, I believe it's only appropriate to mention that if you go over here to the extreme east, and again, I'm drawing it on this map, but it's about 3/4 of a mile, maybe half a mile, 3/4 of a mile to the east, is quite a bit of farmland, ag land. Depending on the year, it could be corn or soybeans. So your main food sources are to the north, the east, and the west, southwest really. So that's kind of a rundown of the setup for this bed. Let's now go to how to approach hunting this buck. So when it comes to hunting this buck, I want to give you 3 scenarios that I think would work. And these kinds of mature bucks that are in really tight quarters, they're secure, but at the same time, there's not a lot of real estate. They are especially prone to the pressure that we put on them as hunters. So you really have to pick and choose quality hunting times to go after a buck like this. At most, I think I've got 3 cracks at this buck in one season. And our season starts the beginning of October and late season ends usually about January 20th. I'm talking that entire length of time. If I go in after this buck more than 3 times, and that's probably pushing it, I'm not going to have a chance at this deer. He will probably just hunker down. The way that I could get 3 cracks at him is to follow the setup that I'm going to describe to you. So before I give you the 3 hunting scenarios, let me just point out, one of the reasons I think it's so critical to find the exact bed, or at least the exact bedroom, because there are a couple of other buck beds in the vicinity of his bed that I think he probably uses on other winds, is that I know exactly where he will most likely come out. He's going to go this direction to the north, or he's going to swing down to the southwest. And so depending upon the wind and depending upon what the food sources look like that year will be a big indicator for me on where I'm going to set up. The first hunting scenario is an extremely early season hunt. Like I'm thinking the first week of hunting season, the first week of October. Because this deer beds in this spot year round, it's not like he's making a huge shift from his summer to his fall quarters and his habits. Of course, during the rut, things will change, but I think I stand a really good chance at having a crack at this buck early season. Now, I need to tell you this. 90% of my hunts are evening hunts, but the early season option here is such that the food source to the north up in here, that for sure that's where he's going on this trail. That food source is a really strong food source. So I know we don't get a lot of fronts that come through in early October, but it's not impossible for it to snow in the northern tier of the whitetails range. And we've had that happen even the first week of October. We almost always have an eastern wind as a front's coming through. And it's almost always straight out of the east. Occasionally we'll get a little more east-southeast or even southeast. Almost never do we get northeastern winds in the area that I live in. But deer tend to move right before and after a front to fill their bellies. And so I would really expect that buck to be filling his belly extra full on a morning in early season when a front's coming through. And if the wind is coming out of the east, what I would do is I would come in here and set up right about there. One of the things that I like about this is all my scent is blowing back to the west toward what is associated for the deer, or what will be associated with the deer, and especially the mature deer. They've lived through a couple of hunting seasons at this point. The pressure. And so I'm not leaving my scent in an area that they're not used to. And I actually think I might be able to get him on his feet during daylight hours coming back from that food source to his bed. Of course, just a couple of weeks into the season, and especially by rifle season, this would probably be an impossibility, because he's going to be alerted to the fact that the pressure has increased. And he's going to be in his bed probably long before darkness disappears in the morning. So I'm going to target the first probably 10 days of the season. And if I get a cold front, I want to be in here on that east wind. Of course, it would work for a southeast wind as well. And in a lot of ways, it's fairly easy to get into this spot without a lot of stress and banging against vegetation, compared to if you had to cross the water area here that makes up the swamp, and circle around beneath, come out from the southern end. So that is my early season deal. It's rather straightforward, and maybe disappointing to some because you want something that's more glamorous. But I think I would wait for a front, because I think that would trigger him maybe just staying in that food source long enough that I get him, just as hunting light opens up, or, a couple of minutes after. And, if that front comes through in the very first week or even the first couple of days, it sounds crazy, but I live in a really pressured hunting state. And yet the first 2 weeks of the season, it is not uncommon that my vehicle is the only vehicle in a parking lot, and that I don't run into anybody at all during those 2 weeks. So I definitely think there's a good potential here to get the buck early season. Okay, so the second scenario that I think would be an effective hunting strategy for this buck would take place October 20th. Seems to be the magical time on most pieces of public land that I hunt for bucks to really start upping their movement. I've seen a lot of really good bucks October 20th. And that usually runs through November 10th. And that is your highest movement of bucks during the year. And of course, as you get closer to that November 10th date, it seems like the movement increases quite a bit more. Our peak rut every year in my area is November 15th. Most of the mating takes place relatively close to November 15th, a couple days on either side of that, which means the primary amount of chasing takes place prior to that. So that's why I use November 10th as the cutoff. And so somewhere between October 20th and November 10th, I think a really good spot to set up would be to come in from the west. I'm going to circle around and drop myself in here and set up here. Now from this spot, I can see out here into this area. And the deer have actually worn this area down, this transition area, where there are a couple of windows to be able to shoot into. Now the reason that I would do this, and of course in this scenario, I'm assuming, let me draw it here, a south wind. So my wind's blowing back up the hillside here. I'd also hunt it on a southwest wind, where my scent's just kind of trickling into this area here. But I'd prefer it to be a south wind if possible. And of course, I'm going to cross this trail that protrudes up through here to the northern food source in a spot where, if possible, I can actually jump across. Now, I certainly don't think that the deer won't be able to sense anything, but if you get in the habit of not stepping on the deer trail itself, and you wear rubber boots and other things that conceal your scent as much as possible, it ups your odds of deer not being spooked to the point where they won't go down the trail. I'm going to assume that by the rut, there's been enough pressure that the buck's in his bed before shooting light. And so I'm going to set up here, not necessarily thinking that I'm going to get him at first light, but instead, and I don't know why this is exactly, in some ways, part of my theory is that maybe mature bucks do this because they let the younger boys, just kind of fool around And then when it's time to get serious, they actually get involved in the action. But I have seen a lot of big mature bucks move between 10 a.m. and noon in the vicinity of the rut during the chase phase. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him get up out of his bed. Of course, I'm probably not going to be able to see him, but I'll hear him. And I think he would come up this way, and I think he would stay in the swamp. So this gives me probably about a 25, 30 yard shot. And the reason I think he's going to come up this way is because of this major doe bedding area, because I think he's going to circle around this and scent check it. And my hope would be that I would actually be able to cut him off before he has a chance to get up to the doe bedding. But I think this is a really good pre-rut chase phase scenario. Of course, during the main part of the rut, this would be a good spot anyway, because bucks will probably be trolling up and down this swamp. But I do like, if possible, if I know about a buck, it is quite a challenge to try to kill the buck that you know is there. And so that would be my primary. Of course, I wouldn't pass up a mature buck if he was passing through, but it would be really cool to set up and have him follow the script, which makes logical sense, and be able to shoot him there. Of course, the exact opposite would be true on a north wind or a northwest wind, which we get a lot of those when it starts cooling down. And what I would do is I'd just do the exact opposite. I would have to cross over the swamp farther down, circle up through this conifer stand, and set myself up here. And then I'm doing exactly the same thing, and I'm expecting the same thing from him. I'm just setting up in a way that he doesn't smell my scent. And now for the third scenario. This would be a late season, so late archery or muzzleloader, which is the day after Christmas until usually January 20th or thereabouts. And it's amazing, there are a lot of people that don't hunt that season. And so the first couple of weeks of late season, I've noticed that deer feel highly pressured, and they often sit pretty tight on public land. But they start to ease up, not back to pre-hunting non-pressured movements, but their movement starts to increase. And that's twofold. I think because the pressure has decreased, they do start moving a little bit more. But the second reason is because the temperatures tend to get colder, we get more snow, and they're not able to hold out as long for food. And so they'll get up and they'll move. And again, what I would expect out of a mature buck like this is he is not going to make it far into the woods. So what I would do is, again, come in from the west, and I'm probably going to set up right here just about on the transition. And I would do this on a couple of different winds. I wouldn't be afraid to do it on a west wind. And I certainly won't be afraid to do it on a southwest or south wind either. You could also do a northwest wind. Your scent would be blowing out here into the swamp. That's dicey, but a lot of times when you have those winds that are just bypassing the bed, it makes the deer feel all the more secure in traveling in that direction. And so I only expect him to get up out of his bed and maybe come out here to the edge and maybe start browsing. There is a spot, even though it looks like a hard transition here, and it is in a lot of ways. But if you've been to a swamp, you know what it's like. There are places where there's just a couple of willows that are growing along the edge, or there's a huge maple tree, and it's got drooping branches, and the leaves are just hanging down. Late season it would just be browse, but those those areas, I think that's where you might see this big buck up on his feet with daylight just about to expire. So I'd set up here and hope that he's going to end up about right there. Of the three scenarios, this is the one that I think has the least chance of working, but it depends on the year. There are years where, I don't know if you've noticed this or if this is true where you hunt, but public land hunting seems to be cyclical for me. So certain tracts of land, they may fly under the radar. They may be, out in the open for everybody to know. You don't have to do much research to find them, but for whatever reason, very few people hunt them. And then somebody shoots a big buck, or somebody talks to somebody and they've got a buddy or a friend that starts hunting the property, and then that person tells somebody, and the next thing you know, the area is way more pressured than it used to be even 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. The same can happen where, and the reason I think it's cyclical is, you start over pressuring public land, way beyond what it already is. The deer just don't move. Eventually, hunters get discouraged because they're not seeing what they're after, and they stop hunting that tract, and then it gets good again. So you have to pay attention to those things. And so if you got a season where there weren't as many people out hunting, maybe rifle season, the first couple of days, there was a lot of rain or the wind was so strong that a lot of people didn't go out or whatever. And I'm talking relatively speaking, because I'm not naive to think that people would skip the opener or anything. It may lend itself to that buck feeling less pressured than he does on another comparative year. And you may have a crack at him. So that's kind of a rundown on the phragmite buck. Curious if you've ever hunted a mature buck in phragmites and what it was like, if you had any success, and what your strategy was. And of course, every situation is different, but almost every phragmite patch that I've ever found is way too dense to be able to get into to hunt on the ground or to set up on the ground and be able to hunt a deer. I would not recommend going down and trying to duke it out with a buck in the phragmite patch. But for sure, if there's a spot that's surrounded by phragmites and you can get yourself up high enough in a tree where you can see down into an open area in the middle of a phragmite section, that would be a really good option on a slot swamp that, as I describe it here. My problem in this situation is there's no way to do this. This is just a solid patch of phragmites. So I'm going to have to wait for the buck to make his move. All right, well, I appreciate you watching the video. My name's Daryl. I'm with Seeds to Dreams Deer. And until next time, I hope that you find more than you think that you're hunting for. Take care.